5.5 Graphs of Sine and Cosine Functions, Day 1. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to graph the sine function. And what I did was wrote the general form. I have my unit circle on the left, so you'll know how we get the points. So basically, the way that the graph works is, remember, sine was the y values. So starting at 0, sine was 0. And then going around the circle at pi over 2, and let me show you, this is 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. So your x values are your radians, and your y values are the sine values at those 5 different angles. So at 0, sine was 0. At pi over 2, sine was 1. At pi, sine was 0. At 3 pi over 2, sine was negative 1. And at 2 pi, sine was 0. So this is the basic sine curve. And the way that it works, you go 0, your max or your maximum value, 0, and then you have your minimum value, and back to 0. So 0 max, 0 min, 0. Now the amplitude, which is the absolute value of A, will give you that maximum value. And it just tells you how high your curve is. Your period is always 2 pi over B. And when they refer to a period, this is a period. So that's the length of your cycle. Your phase shift, which we always call horizontal shift, that's the part in parentheses, the x minus c. So if you see minus, you're moving right, just like in the other graphs we learned in Algebra 2. And if you see plus, we're actually moving left. So minus is right c units, and plus is left c units. Your midline, or your vertical shift, is always y equals d. It is always a line. So that's like the middle or the mid of your graph. So in this case, your midline is 0. And then, of course, you always have 5 key points. And we call them quarter points because you always do 1/4 of your period. And whatever that value is, you add that value to your x coordinates: 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. In example 1, we're going to graph 1 period. 1 period means that there are going to be 5 critical points. The first thing I do is rewrite this in the correct form because you want x by itself. So I'm going to factor out a 2 pi, which is like distributing backwards. And that's going to leave me with x plus 2. So just make sure when you distribute, you get back what you started with. And then I identify A, B, C, and D. And I always put this plus 0 here. So everything is here. So A is 3. B is 2 pi because it'll be whatever is in front of the parentheses. C is negative 2 because remember it's always opposite. And D is 0. So my amplitude is the absolute value of A, which is 3. That gives you your max. Your period is 2 pi over b, which in this case is 1. Your phase shift, since c is negative, means we're going to move everything left 2. Your midline is y equals 0. So to get your key points, remember there are 5 of them. So I'm just going to label my x's. Your first x will always be where your phase shift started. So it's going to be -2. And then you take 1/4 of your period, because everything is labeled in quarter points. And you're going to add 1/4 to get to the next x value. So our first is at -2. So you take -2 plus 1/4. Remember, you have to get common denominators. That's -8/4 plus 1/4 gives us -7/4. -7/4 plus 1/4 is -6/4. Now you can reduce it or you can leave it. -6/4 plus 1/4 is -5/4. -5/4 plus 1/4 is -4/4, which is -1. So if you notice, all my x values are negative. So I'm going to start at the left because everything got shifted left to. And you're going to take these values and place them on your x-axis. Your max, remember, is at +3. Your min is -3. Then you follow your curve. Your sine curve goes 0, max, 0, min, 0. And this is your midline. So your max and your minimum should be 3 units from your midline. In example 2, let's look what happens when you have a -a. So I check my equation, and I'm going to write it in the correct form again, because you want x by itself. So I'm going to factor out a 2. Now this can be tricky because you're doing pi over 2 divided by 2, which is the same thing as pi over 2 times the reciprocal, which is 1 over 2, which means that's going to give us pi over 4. So identify A, -2, B is 2, C is positive pi over 4, it's always opposite. In my D, I'm going to do +0 is 0. Your amplitude is the absolute value of A, which is 2. Your period is 2 pi over B, which is pi. Your phase shift, we're moving everything right, pi over 4 units. Midline is still y equals 0. All right, to get your key points, remember there are 5, and we are starting with pi over 4. And you're going to do 1/4 times your period, which is pi over 4. So each time we are adding pi over 4 units to get to the next value. So pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4. You can reduce it or you can leave it. 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. If I add it again, I'm going to get 4 pi over 4, which is pi. And 4 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4 is 5 pi over 4. So notice all of my x values are positive. And you just place them on your x-axis. And my max is 2. My min is -2. My midline is at 0. Now, when your A is negative, your graph actually, you're going to have a vertical reflection. So you're going to go now 0, min 0, max. Excuse me, 0. Collins. There was a shift. You have to be careful. So you got to start it at pi over 4. Here we go. 0, min 0, max 0. So if you can see it reflected. Example 3. Now this equation is already in the form. I'm just going to rewrite it so you can see. A is 5. B is always what is in front of the the parentheses, which is a 1, not a 0. C is 0, and D is 0. Amplitude, the absolute value of A, which is 5. Your period is 2 pi over B, which is 2 pi. Phase shift, in this case, there is no shift. Midline is y equals 0. Remember to get your key points. You're going to start at your phase shift, which there isn't any. So we're going to start our first x at 0. And remember, you do 1/4 times your period, which is 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. So each time we are adding pi over 2. So 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 2 pi over 2, which is the same thing as pi. And then 2 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. So this looks like our unit circle, the basic sine graph, except we have a max at 5 and a min at -5. And then you place your x-coordinates on your x-axis. So we have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And remember, sine graphs, 0, max, 0, min, 0.